Sea Houses. Chapter 27. June 1913. Jimmy thought his bones might fall out of his body as the train rattled over the tracks. He had reached Beale on foot, then bought himself a third-class ticket for the princely sum of 1 shilling and 6pence. As miles swept by, his seat became harder and his backside ached. Wind whistled through the carriage, and soon he was wearing most of the clothes from his bag. Relief flooded him as the train pulled into Chat Hill and he disembarked.
"You're catching the branch line to Northumberland, lad," called the guard. "Nah, I fancy a walk," said Jimmy, waving as he turned away.
Ahead of him stretched open countryside. It was a relief to be on his feet, away from the incessant bangs, clanks and hoots of the train. He had thought little beyond his initial escape, and now wished he had formed a plan. Uncertainty tugged at him as he wondered whether this was all a mistake. What if no crew took him on? Sea Houses was his first port of call. He hoped to find his way to the pub he remembered from the night of the rescue. After walking for an hour, Jimmy found a grassy bank to rest on. He drank from his water flask, trying to push pessimistic thoughts from his head. All his life he had strived to be the antithesis of his dad, sure and steady. Now he risked it all on a gamble. One thing he knew with certainty: the silver darlings were out there, primed and ready for the chase. Given the chance, he would prove himself an asset to the hunt. The miles slid by beneath his feet. Dusk was seeping in, and Jimmy wasn't keen to enter a new town after dark. He headed towards the empty dunes and found a comfortable place to settle. His body welcomed a break from its ramblings, and his mind welcomed the stillness of the open sky. Head on his bag, Jimmy gazed at the darkening sky, stars breaking through the gloom. The night was cloudless, and despite the cold it would bring, Jimmy would stay dry. He lay still, watching the stars intensify, forming a luminescent blanket. Tiredness swept through his body, and he closed his eyes. He fell sound asleep, and though the cold woke him several times, on each occasion, sleep won out. The sun edged up from the horizon, and loud squawking caused Jimmy to stir. Gulls circled high above, and the sky turned pastel blue. He propped himself up on an elbow and looked around. The imposing hulk of Bamburgh Castle towered over the coastline, offering protection and beauty in equal measure. The sand in front of him swept down to clear, calm waters. To his right, wide rocks snagged the air, shimmering pools emerging among them as the tide receded. The song of the dawn chorus signalled it was early, but Jimmy was restless to begin his adventure. He brushed sand from his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and made his way along the beach. Worry plagued his mind as he reached the harbour. He had been expecting an expanse of boats. Though busy, there were no Scaffies, Fifees or Zulus that characterised the Scots herring fleet. Had he mistimed his island escape? He hoped not, for the coins in his tin wouldn't see him through for long. His stomach growled. It had been hours since he had eaten. He perched himself on the harbour wall and pulled out his notebook and pencil before replacing them in his bag. Best to wait until he was more settled before writing to Clara. He wanted her to think him a success, not a man with no plan, no job and no food in his belly. From the harbour, he noticed the island nestling on the horizon. He pictured Clara baiting lines and felt a sharp pang of regret that he had left her behind. His eyes settled on the Fan Islands, enjoying their impressive barrenness, before hitching his legs onto the wall and making himself comfortable against the hard stone. Retrieving a book from his bag, he lay himself out on the harbour wall and read. By the time he emerged from the imaginary world of Dickens, the harbour had grown busy with locals, readying nets and lines for the season ahead. Jimmy swung his legs down and jumped from the wall. He nodded to the fishermen he passed as he walked along the harbour. With the map of his memory, he found the King's Arms where the landlord was putting out his board.
"Ye open? You're keen, aren't you, lad?" laughed the fat publican, signalling for Jimmy to follow him inside. "What can I get you?" Alcohol was the last thing Jimmy wanted. He longed for a bowl of oats and a cup of fresh milk, but keen to fit in, he ordered an ale. "Stan," the publican said, leaning across the bar to shake hands. Jimmy introduced himself. "Where have you come from? I've not seen you before." "Sir, I have been here once, with the Holy Island lifeboat crew." Stan squinted at him and scratched at his stubbled chin. "Aye, I remember that young lad with the ship's crew." "He'd been fishing," said Jimmy, and as the memory flooded back, the publican slapped the bar and let out a loud guffaw. "Aye, I remember now. You're a long way from home, aren't you?" Jimmy was keen to avoid too many questions. "It's time I made my way in the world." Stan hesitated, weighing up whether to question Jimmy further. Then, deciding against it, he laid a pint down on the bar. "You looking for work?" "Aye, I'm hoping to join a herring crew." Stan scratched his chin. You're early. Most of the Scots crews are due end of the week. Will you be all right till then?" "Aye," said Jimmy. He smiled at Stan and cradled the glass in his hands, wondering how he would manage a full 5 days with no work or board. With a few large gulps, he finished his pint and thanked Stan. "Come back Friday lunchtime. I'll introduce you to some fellows." Jimmy was despondent as he left the pub and headed back to the harbour to make a few inquiries with local crews. None needed an extra pair of hands, and he slunk away, embarrassed by his misfortune. He called in at a grocer and filled his bag with enough bread, milk and fish to last a few days. After a quick glance around, he decided the best route would be to follow the coast and headed south. Jimmy walked for several miles until fine sand turned to smooth round rocks the size of a man's head. Clear water rushed back and forth, and above the beach, the sky slipped from blue to pink. Wisps of cloud lay in arrows across the sky, pointing to grand ruins that stood stubbornly above the shore. He climbed a grassy bank behind the beach, standing among crumbling castle walls. Heavy stone rose in towers to the sky, its curved walls evidence of man's tenacity and engineering. He contemplated setting a camp within them, but there was an eeriness to the place that made him reconsider. Instead, he found a section of the outer walls where two joined, making a pleasant shelter from prevailing winds. He pinned his sou'wester upon them with several large rocks and crawled inside his shelter. The mossy grass made a cosy bed. With no evidence of recent human activity, Jimmy was certain the only disturbance would be from the occasional rabbit. Night was drawing in, his Gansey keeping him warm against the chilly air. He ate a simple meal of bread and fish, then fell into the deepest of sleeps. Determined to shake the moroseness of the previous day, Jimmy resolved to keep himself busy. He filled his days reading and exploring, glad to have packed several books, for absorbed in their worlds, time flew. On his final evening, he walked back along the beach to be near the King's Arms when it opened its doors. He arrived in Sea Houses at dusk and found a comfortable position on the south beach. His eyes had just closed when he heard distant shouts. He sat up and in the dim light saw two figures, wrapped together like lovers. Their movements abrupt and exaggerated. Jimmy realised this was no embrace, but a fight. Jimmy crept forward on his haunches, moving with stealth against the sand. Their aggression might have shocked other men, but for Jimmy it was familiar, and he remained calm. A stocky man knelt against the arms of another, pinning him to the sand. Against the dark sky, Jimmy saw blood spraying from the victim's mouth in rhythmic spurts that matched the aggressor's punches. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The bloodied man lay on the sand like a rag doll, head whipping with every punch, unable to lift his arms in defence. Something in Jimmy stirred. He was loath to intervene, but this was no fair match. The man on the sand could die if he didn't help. Now only an arm's length from them, Jimmy leaped up and onto the stocky man's back. "Stop!" yelled Jimmy. "Stop!" His arms wrapped round the man's neck, who struggled against Jimmy's weight, roaring and flinging himself back. Jimmy held tight. "Get off me, you bastard!" shouted the man. Jimmy clung on. The man scrabbled around in the sand, then flung his right arm back towards Jimmy's head. Everything went black. Chapter 28. June 1913. When Jimmy woke, darkness surrounded him. He reached for his glass of water, but his hand sank into something soft. Fingers feeling around, he realised he was lying on sand, not the old chair in his cottage or the floor of his shed. He tried to lift his head, but pain ripped through it and he winced. His hand reached for his forehead and touched the stickiness of blood running from his hairline to his cheek. Beside him was the man he'd tried to save. He was not moving, and Jimmy dragged himself closer. His face to the man's mouth, he sighed in relief as the faint tickle of breath reached his skin. Jimmy slumped onto the sand and rested his hands on his chest. He lay still, considering the best course of action. The man was breathing, but needed help. He turned himself onto his front and dragged his knees up under his stomach. Hands pushing down hard against the sand, he lifted himself upright. Dizziness made him stumble, and a wave of nausea swept through him. He leant over, retching. Wiping saliva from his chin, Jimmy took big gulps of sea air until steadier on his feet. With the moon no longer swaying before his eyes, he crouched behind the unconscious man. He slipped his hands beneath him, levered him off the ground, then hooked an arm below the man's knees. The bruised body lay limp in his arms. Soft sand caused him to stumble, and he almost dropped the invalid. With greater care, he walked on, feet shuffling under the man's weight. It was a relief to reach a solid path, and soon Jimmy found himself among the lights of the harbour. "Help!" he called. No one came. "Help!" A curious party of men appeared beside a boat. They squinted in the darkness, then recognizing the man in Jimmy's arms, rushed towards him. Instead of the help he craved, they wrenched the man from his arms. A strong, tall Viking of a man gripped Jimmy's own arms behind his back. "What did ye do to him? What did ye do to him?" Jimmy's mind burned with pain and confusion. "I did nothing. I tried to help." The man twisted Jimmy's arms tighter, causing him to yell out. Pain brought a moment of clarity. "Check my hands," Jimmy begged. His captor gave a final vicious twist of Jimmy's arms before yanking his hands out in front to examine them. "I need a light," he called. A man rushed over with a candle and held it to Jimmy's palms. The Viking turned Jimmy's hands over and studied his knuckles. "Now there," he said. As he released his grip, Jimmy collapsed to the ground. When he came to, Jimmy was staring at his feet, head between his knees. He sat up and the group of men surrounding him gave a collective sigh of relief. "Glad you're all right, lad," said the tall brute who had pinned his arms back. Jimmy looked at him, confused. "You told us to check your hands, remember? We can see that you did no damage to our friend here. Did you see the culprit?" Jimmy recounted the man he had seen. On hearing the description, someone in the group muttered, "Martin," and the Viking declared, "I'll kill him." "Calm down, Callum," said a slim man, stepping through the throng. "We need him, whether or not we like it. I'll deal with him my way." "Aye, skipper," said Callum. The skipper knelt beside Jimmy. "How can we thank you?" Jimmy shook his head. "I would like to leave now." The men moved aside to let him pass. Jimmy made his way along the harbour, finding his bag on the beach and sinking down beside it. He tried to stay awake, worried the other man might return, but tiredness won out, and he was soon asleep. Next morning, Jimmy wondered if he had dreamed the night's events. He had slept longer than intended, and the sun was rising fast in the morning sky. With no food in his bag, he drank the last of his water to stave off his hunger. At the water's edge, he splashed himself, revived as icy water trickled from his neck to his back. A week of salt water matted his curls, but at least he was clean. Pangs of hunger came in waves,
but he grabbed his bag and headed for the town. At the harbour, Jimmy let out a low whistle. In the light of day he saw hundreds of boats, all shapes and sizes, jostling for position in their haven. He wandered around, perusing the different boats, wondering if he would have the chance to work on any. The King's Arms was open, and walking in, he saw Stan holding court behind the bar. "What's happened to you?" Stan took in Jimmy's impressive gash. "Wrong place, wrong time," said Jimmy. Stan laughed and handed him a pint. "Ta," said Jimmy. He wanted to sit down, the ale making him light-headed on an empty stomach, but he was keen not to appear rude. "Where did you stay last night?" "It was late when I got back, so I slept on the beach." "You hungry?" Jimmy nodded, and the man shouted through to the back of the pub. "Mary, we've got a lad here needs feeding up." A plump lady waddled through to the bar and set a plate down in front of Jimmy. On it was a stotty, warm from the stove, filled with a slice of ham and a good dollop of peas pudding. Jimmy's eyes widened and his mouth watered. "Ta," he said. "How much do I owe you?" "On the house," said Stan, before moving off to sweep the floor. It was the most delicious meal Jimmy had eaten since Anna's broth. With no one to check his manners, he took large bites, rubbing the pudding from his chin as it dribbled down in his haste. He ate fast, his stomach hurt, and he leaned back in his chair. He sipped his ale slowly, aware he must keep his wits about him if he were to impress the local men. The pub filled. Shyness crept in. He was an outsider amongst friends. After attending to his customers, Stan appeared next to Jimmy. "Come with me, lad," he said, and Jimmy followed him across the room. "This here is Graham," said Stan, motioning to a slim man in his mid-30s, with kind eyes and a cropped ginger beard. "We've met." Jimmy took a step back. With a steady gaze, the skipper from the previous night nodded a greeting. He moved forward, and Jimmy flinched, eyeing the outstretched hand with suspicion. Graham offered his hand again. Sensing no aggression to Graham's movements, Jimmy took his hand in a gesture of friendship. "Apologies again for last night. It was a most unfortunate way to cross paths." Jimmy nodded but said nothing. Used to smoothing out confrontation, Stan moved the conversation on. "Graham, this young lad is from Holy Island. He wants to make his own way in the world." Graham caught Stan's eye, and his own creased in amusement. "That right, lad? And how do you hope to do that?" he asked in his broad Scots accent. "I'm looking to join a crew, sir, to work the herring." The inside of Jimmy's mouth had gone dry, but his palms were sweaty. Graham continued to stare at him. "Got experience?" "Aye, I've been working my dad's boat since I was a bairn, and I've done the herring season on the island the last few years." "Can I ask why you're not helping your father any more?" Jimmy shuffled and stared at the floor. His hand reached to the gash on his forehead. After a pause, Graham clapped his hands together. "Nae bother. You can work for me as a half-share man and sleep on the boat. That sound all right to you?" Jimmy shuffled, and Graham, sensing the cause of his discontent, continued. "Look, lad, you need the work, and after last night, we're one man short." Is he? "Oh, no, lad. John's fine. At least he will be once he's back home under the care of his mammy. Not sure what state he'd be in if you'd not come to his rescue, though." "And the other man?" "Martin." Graham's face darkened. "Well, he's staying. For now. He'll be on a tight leash, though, and I can promise you won't get any more trouble from him. How about it?" Jimmy considered the offer. He needed the work, and Graham seemed a sound enough fellow. He reckoned with the training his dad had given him, he'd have no trouble avoiding any flying fists. "Aye, all right then. Thank you, sir." Jimmy shook hands with more enthusiasm. "One thing, lad," said Graham as he stood to leave. "My name's Graham, not sir, so no more of that, all right?" "Aye, sir. Graham," said Jimmy, blushing. As he headed for the door, Graham waved his cap in the air and called to Jimmy. "Start tonight.
6 o'clock sharp at the harbour. My boat's the Stargazer." And with that, he left. Jimmy continued to sit at the table, his head spinning with the turn of events. Stan placed a jug of ale down in front of him, the liquid spilling over its edges as it landed. "Sounds like it's all settled then, lad." "Aye, it is. Ta." Jimmy spent the rest of the day mooching around the village. He liked it, but didn't intend to get attached. He was following the Silver Darlings, and would soon be on his way again. Chapter 29. June 1913. By 5:30, Jimmy reached the harbour. He searched among endless rows of vessels before spotting the neat curling letters of the Stargazer. Graham was already on deck, and Jimmy strolled over. The boat was a beauty. A Zulu of 80 feet if she were an inch. Her pine mast stretched to the sky, and Jimmy thought she would graze the stars while gazing at them. Her bow stood vertical and proud, while her raked stern hinted at speed and manoeuvrability. It impressed Jimmy to see she had a steam capstan, a technology which had not yet reached the island fleet. Her painted hull suggested someone loved her well. Next to her, the Mary Lou would look like a discarded child's toy. "You're early," said Graham, glancing up from his nets. "Aye. Sorry." Graham pulled himself up and looked hard at Jimmy. "Don't apologise, lad. It's a good start." "Like her?" he asked, leaning against the mast. "Aye, I love her." Graham climbed up out of the boat and clapped Jimmy on the back. "Come on, I'll introduce you to the lads." Jimmy followed Graham further along the harbour. A gaggle of men were leaning against the harbour wall and straightened on seeing their skipper approach. "Lads, meet Jimmy." "Jimmy, meet the lads." A large man stepped forward, head hanging low. I'm sorry for being so rough with you last night. Can we put it behind us and start afresh?" His eyes peered up from beneath his thick-set brow, a warmth to them that made Jimmy smile. "Aye, nae bother." Jimmy offered a hand to shake, but Callum pulled him into an embrace so tight it sucked the breath from him. When freed from Callum's arms, Jimmy shook hands with the men, all different shapes and sizes, but with the same rough hands, sandpaper skin calloused by thousands of yards of line, ropes, and salt water. He tried to match names to faces, but they threw introductions out with such speed he struggled to commit them to memory. Martin lurked at the back. His head lifted, and Jimmy recognised the black sunken eyes and thin lips. His face was purple, and dried blood clung to a split on his bottom lip. He had not escaped the previous night's antics unscathed. Martin glared at Jimmy with dark, beady eyes, lip curling despite the pain its movement caused. "Shake Jimmy's hand," said Graham. Martin didn't move. In 2 large strides, Graham reached Martin and hauled him up by a fistful of shirt. He didn't shout, but his calm voice held a great deal of power. "Shake Jimmy's hand, or you'll be the one heading north in need of your mam." Graham dropped Martin to the floor. He stumbled, then held out a hand. Graham seemed satisfied and turned towards his boat. The crew followed him. "Right, lads, let's away," he said. The men all leapt into action. Jimmy's first impressions of Graham proved sound. He was an excellent skipper. As his crew took up their oars and headed out of the harbour, he kept his eyes fixed on the sea ahead, small white crests forming as the summer breeze teased the water. As the moon ascended, its light fell in shards on the dancing waves and lit the sky in a supernatural glow. "You know what to look for?" The first test, thought Jimmy. Clues of Silver Darlings rolled off his tongue. Graham said nothing, but nodded, satisfied that Jimmy had some knowledge. With the sails billowing and a fair wind behind them, the boat ploughed through choppy water, up and down as breath moves a man's chest. Graham straightened up, and Jimmy followed his line of sight. Gulls circled nearby, and below them the brooding sea had an oily shimmer to its surface. Graham guided the boat to the required position
and instructed the men to shoot the nets. The warp held the base of the net wall firm. Corks and buffs bobbed above the choppy water. Taking his lead from the experienced crew, Jimmy helped lower the sails and mainmast, and the boat drifted with the tide. "Get your rest while you can, lads. There'll be plenty of work soon, all being well." They shared round oat cakes, salted beef and tea, and with bellies full, the men hunkered down in the hull to rest. Not long after midnight, with the wind whipping up and the troughs of the waves deepening, Graham woke them and instructed them to haul. Callum and Tom rushed to operate the capstan, and soon the warp wound in. Shoulder to shoulder with the crew, Jimmy hauled in miles of nets. The catch wasn't the largest he'd seen, but enough to strain his muscles for a good 5 hours hauling. Martin appeared with a large scoop net, and Jimmy realised he was the scummer, reaching down to catch large herring which had escaped their mesh prison. Jimmy wondered if it was a demotion. With the nets in, Jimmy grabbed a wooden shovel and helped sweep thousands of iridescent bodies into the hold. They hoisted the lug sails with the help of the steam capstan, and the race back to the harbour began. Dawn broke, and the stargazer cut a fine sight as she sped through the rough seas. Red-brown sails bloated with the strong north-easterly that battered the vessel and excited the waters below. Jimmy helped clean and store the nets, and soon land appeared on the horizon. Mooring up in the busy harbour was a task. Again, Graham's quiet skill and confidence proved an asset to the crew. Once tucked away in the busy harbour and fish unloaded in their swills, the men climbed back onto dry land. "I'll see you at the pub," called Graham, heading off to the market to ensure they got a decent price for the catch. The other men strolled along the harbour while Jimmy stayed aboard the Stargazer. Callum looked behind him and, noticing Jimmy on board, jogged back to the boat. "What you doing here by yourself?" "Oh, I wasn't sure if you'd want me tagging along," said Jimmy. Callum let out a hearty laugh. "Come on, you daft idiot." He offered Jimmy a hand and pulled him onto the dock. Jimmy fell in with Callum's loping strides, and soon they had caught the rest of the crew. Stan greeted them as they entered the gloomy interior of his pub, keen to hear the size of their catch. "So, they haven't thrown you overboard yet?" he asked, winking at Jimmy. "Not yet," said Jimmy, taking the offered pint and sipping the froth from the top. "He's all right, this one," said Callum, clapping Jimmy on the back and causing the amber liquid to rise, leaving Jimmy with a foamy moustache. Jimmy wiped his sleeve across his lip and smiled at his crew members. Only Martin kept his mouth set in its hard line and didn't return his smile. Graham returned from the market and treated his crew to another round. Setting Jimmy's pint before him, he leant in close and offered quiet praise for his work. Jimmy flushed with pride. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, and there would be no fishing till it had passed. The crew settled in for a night's drinking, but with Alex never far from his thoughts, Jimmy made his excuses and left. Whatever path his life took, he would never become his father's son. A few men were milling around the harbour when Jimmy returned, but with the wind howling and the sky turning black, it wasn't long before they retreated to the nearest pub. Jimmy settled himself down in the hull and pulled a canvas sheet across to protect him from the elements. The rain started, the splat of plump drops on the canvas turning to a constant barrage, the noise deafening. Trickles of water slipped through gaps in the canvas, and Jimmy adjusted the sheet. If he could stay dry, he would be cosy enough. Chapter 30. July 1913. Dearest Clara, I hope this letter finds you well. I've made it to Northumberland and I've been working on a boat out of sea houses. I'm only a half-share man, but I hope it won't be long till I've saved enough for my own nets. Graham, my skipper, is kind, though he's no soft touch. He reminds me of your da, though Graham's beard is ginger and his frame slight. He is from somewhere north of Aberdeen, and the rest of the crew are from villages round about that area. They're a friendly bunch. One is a tall Scot called Callum, who has shown me the ropes.
He looks like a Viking with bright red hair and a flowing ginger beard. I'm a fair height, but Callum dwarfs me, and you don't want to make him laugh, for he'll clap you on the back and knock the wind right out of you. Samuel is from the same village in the Highlands, and seems suspicious of this southerner, but I shall win him round. Tom is a merry lad, with a song to sing or a joke to tell. His good humour is most welcome after we've been hauling for many an hour. The only fellow I have trouble with is the boat's scummer, Martin. Jimmy paused his writing. He wanted to tell Clara about the fight, but deciding it might worry her, he spared her the details. I think he resents me being brought into the crew halfway through the season. I try my best to have a friendly word when I can, but he doesn't seem interested in anything I have to say. If I am being honest, he reminds me of my da, an unhappy soul. The other men are right enough. All are experienced with the herring and have welcomed me as best I could hope for. I think I've proved myself hard-working, and most have accepted me into their little gang. Herring are plenty here, and my first few weeks on the boat have been busy ones. We returned on our third night with 10 creels. You can imagine the fuss that caused among the herring girls on our return. I've been sleeping in the boat, which is not that different from the old shed. It's comfortable since I found the smoothest place in the hull. On dry nights, I look up at a blanket of stars. I can see the island in the distance, and I often think of you. How is everyone at home? Are things more comfortable between you, Rachel and Bill? The barren must be on its way soon. It's a strange thought. I will be their uncle, and you their sister. What a funny turn life can take. Send my love to all the island, and tell my mam I am safe and well. I shall be in sea houses for a few months yet, so you can write to me at the King's Arms. They are good folk there, and will pass the letter on. All for now. Jimmy. Jimmy crammed away his paper and pencil as the crew approached the Stargazer. Rumours were circulating of a large shoal further down the coast, and they headed off early to try their luck. It was a fine evening, a half-moon rising in the evening sky and clear, calm waters. There was just enough wind to propel the Stargazer along, and all signs were hopeful. After shooting the nets, the men took their rest. Dawn was breaking before Graham called on them to haul. By now, they had the routine down to a fine art, and all took their positions to begin their work. The net didn't feel too heavy, but the crew hoped that there might at least be a few crans worth in the haul. They began hauling, but it soon became clear something was wrong. As the nets rose, the muscles in Graham's face clenched. A few herring lay silver, blue and green within them, but these were the exception. With horror, the men hauled net after net of rags, large holes ripped through, frayed twists of hemp playing in the water like ghostly fingers. Repulsive severed fish heads, eyes staring out from bloodied faces, lay strewn within the broken nets. "Dogfish," said Graham. It was a grim job hauling the miles of nets. Some they could save. Most were beyond repair. A few perpetrators remained caught, and the delight Martin took in destroying them sent an uncomfortable ripple through the crew. Ruined nets lay in haphazard piles, for there was no point storing them properly. After raising the lug sail and turning to shore, the men sailed home in silence. Graham kept his eyes ahead, speaking to no one. With arms full of broken nets, the crew walked along the harbour and made their way to Craster Yard. Damaged nets carpeted the ground as they surveyed the extent of their losses. "I bet you're happy to be a half-share man," said Martin. He sucked hard on a pipe, yet still managed a sneer, which Jimmy ignored. "Shut your mouth unless you've something helpful to say," said Graham. If Martin were chastened by his skipper's rebuke, he didn't show it, leaning back against the wall of the yard, his dark eyes disappearing beneath a plume of smoke. Jimmy was not happy. Lost nets would cost them dear, but it relieved him he hadn't yet made enough to buy his own. They sorted the nets into piles, those that could mend and those that were goners. With the work finished, the men stood back, surveying the disparity between the piles. Only 4 nets were worth mending. One thing was certain, they would not be leaving sea houses with much money in their pockets. "Best go see about buying some nets," said Graham. The crew followed him out of the yard, but Jimmy stayed behind, more an outsider than since he joined the crew. A red-faced woman in a grim oilskin apron appeared, hands on her hips, taking stock of the scene before her. "Terrible night for you, so I've heard." "Aye, right it was. Need a hand with these nets?" Jimmy managed a faint smile. She disappeared, returning moments later with 2 stools. "Come on then. What you waiting for? These nets won't mend themselves." Jimmy sat down and set to work. Grateful for her help, he would make sure he recompensed her from his own pocket. Her endless chatter soothed him, and his spirits lifted as they began rectifying the damage inflicted. It was hours before the crew returned, tired and irritated by the dent in their purses. They lay their new nets down in a neat pile at one end of the yard. Jimmy and the woman had mended a quarter of one net when they appeared, and Graham gave Jimmy a nod to show his gratitude for the progress made. "It'll be a few days before we can head out again. Get some rest and we can meet back here tomorrow to tar. Watch you don't drink too much tonight. We're low on funds as it is." With that, Graham strode from the yard. Jimmy stayed with the woman. His speed impressed her, and his mind turned to Rose, who had trained him up well over the years. They worked until the light was fading, and Jimmy's stomach growled. "Come to mind for some food?" the woman asked. "Aye, ta," said Jimmy. The woman introduced herself as Maisie and led Jimmy through the town to a small cottage not much bigger than his childhood home. "Mum! Mum!" grubby children cried as their mother returned. Her brood met Maisie with a list of demands. She gave them each a quick hug before stoking the fire and laying bowls on the table. It was impossible to guess her age, but Jimmy placed her around the 40 mark. He couldn't count the number of bairns, for they tore round the cottage, running in and out to the yard and mingling with friends on the street. Her home contained only a few tired items of furniture, but the warmth of the woman towards her bairns made the space homely. Jimmy offered to help, and she set a large bowl of potatoes in front of him. "Peel those." Maisie was fascinated to learn Jimmy had grown up on the island she saw from the harbour. "It must be a right magical place," she said. "I often make up stories about it for the bairns when I'm trying to settle them." He liked the woman, and reluctant to shatter her illusions, spoke of the caves, the ruined priory, walking along the shore. His tales thrilled Maisie. When she questioned him about his family, he spoke of Marnie, skipping any details of his dad. She was no fool, and knew there was more to tell, but chose not to press further when she sensed her questions hit a nerve. With the potatoes peeled and boiled, Maisie hollered through the cottage, and with a scampering of footsteps, the place was filled with children. She looked round the room. "Billy, Sid and Katie, head on back to your own house and eat your own food." 3 impostors giggled and ran out of the cottage. The meal was a simple one of potatoes and smoked fish, but it filled Jimmy as much by Maisie's kindness as the food. Her table was not big enough for all to sit at, and 5 boys and 4 girls sprawled across the room, some on chairs, others on the floor. At a guess, the children seemed aged from 5 to 18, and Jimmy blushed as he caught one of Maisie's teenage daughters staring. She was pretty enough, but Jimmy was saving his heart for Clara. "Is your husband out fishing?" "No, my Dan's been gone 4 years now. Lost him to the sea in a winter storm. Now it's just me and the bairns." There was sadness in Maisie's voice, and Jimmy thought her Dan must have been a fine fellow for her to still grieve his loss. He admired Maisie for keeping the house while being the sole earner. "The older bairns help me out. We're lucky to have the herring call on these parts, and there's plenty of work here if you want it enough." When the meal had finished, Jimmy helped Maisie's pretty daughter clear away the plates. His hand brushed hers, and she giggled. Jimmy blushed at the curious tingling that touch had brought. "Well, I'd best be off. Ta very much for your kindness. Will I see you at the yard tomorrow?" "Aye, I'm there every day," said Maisie, giving Jimmy a warm hug before sending him on his way.
Jimmy woke early and headed straight for the yard. Maisie was already at the nets, and Jimmy resolved to pay her more than the going rate. He settled himself down beside her. They had been working for 2 hours when the crew arrived to bark and tar the new nets. Graham strolled over to check Jimmy's progress and clapped him on the back on seeing the net half mended.
"I reckon we'll be at sea by the end of the week," he said.
Callum, Martin, Samuel and Tom trudged round the yard, and Graham confided,
"King's Arms,"
before walking over to chivvy them along. As the sun rose to its highest point, Maisie's daughter arrived with a basketful of oatcakes and bread.
"Thought you could do with some feeding," she called.
The men dived into the basket. They offered thanks through full mouths, and it was a merry group despite their misfortune. Jimmy caught the young girl's eye, and both blushed. Callum noticed and gave Jimmy both a wink and a sharp dig in the ribs.
"Something there takes your fancy?" he whispered, spraying Jimmy with crumbs. "Shut up," said Jimmy.
Callum laughed.
"Herring lassies are a perk of the job," he said, grinning.
Jimmy ignored him. No girl could match Clara's wild island beauty, and he would not give up on her. Chapter 31. September 1913. The dawning of a Sunday signalled a welcome rest for Jimmy and the crew. He woke to the scatter of golden shards on cornflower blue water. Jimmy wished he could share the view with Clara. He pulled out his writing paper, but put it away again. The past weeks had been the same. He had little new to tell. The dogfish had spared them after the fateful night, and the fishing had been fair. Graham seemed pleased with his work, but no grand moments occurred that lent themselves to pen and paper. It irked him that Clara had not written, but he decided she must have her reasons, and he would not break his promise out of spite. He pulled out a book from his bag and leaned against the warm, smooth wood of the boat to read. Footsteps approached, and a shadow blocked the sun. Startled, Jimmy blocked the sun with his hand and saw Graham standing on the quayside.
"What you got there, lad?"
Graham said. Jimmy held up his copy of Robert Burns for Graham to see.
"Any good?"
"Aye," said Jimmy.
"That's why I didn't notice ye standing there."
Graham chuckled.
"You're a clever lad, Jimmy. You'll make a fine skipper one day. Your big brain will waste away if not."
"I enjoy being part of the crew," said Jimmy. "Besides, anything away from my da is right by me." He grinned at Graham.
"Aye, well, you're a good worker, that's for sure. I just don't like to see a big brain like yours being wasted. Come on, I thought I'd take you to church."
With his book packed away, Jimmy jumped up onto the quayside to follow Graham. He led Jimmy up through the village to where the little Presbyterian church stood. Most of the pews were already full, and the hum of conversation was heavy with Scots voices. Jimmy followed Graham to a pew where the rest of the crew sat, and they squeezed themselves into the small space. Quiet descended as the preacher took to his pulpit and heads bowed in prayer. No man could underestimate faith when he threw himself on the mercy of the elements daily. At the first hymn they stood, and Jimmy saw men outnumbered women 2-1. A few families stood at the front, all dressed in their Sunday best. Hearty male voices followed the organ's melodies, singing praise and thanks to their Creator. Jimmy found it hard to believe in God as his da's fists flew, but here he was drawn into the collective fervour. As the service ended, the men filed out, shaking hands with the preacher as they stepped into the warm autumn sunshine. The village was quiet, people resting in their homes. Graham suggested they take a stroll, and the crew followed him towards the beach. Change was in the air. The nights were drawing in, and the herring were diminishing. Restlessness grew among the crew, who sensed the time was approaching when they would move on. Other vessels had already left, and the harbour had lost its characteristic bustle. For several days, the men debated whether Great Yarmouth or Lowestoft should be their destination, and they settled on the latter. They knew Lowestoft well, and most were keen to return.
Callum regaled them with stories of herring lassies he met there. "An excellent reason to return to Lowestoft, lads." Graham turned to Jimmy. "You coming with us?" "Aye, if you'll have me." Graham laughed and clapped Jimmy on the back. The thought of putting more water between himself and the island pleased Jimmy. Perched on the horizon, he hadn't broken from its shackles. Sea houses was close enough for Alex to find, and they were near enough fishing the same waters. "A change will be good," said Jimmy. The crew sat themselves down on the sand and began making plans for their journey. Graham explained the route and the areas they would need to watch out for. "All being well, we'll be in Lowestoft within the week." "What's it like?" asked Jimmy. "Full of pretty lassies," said Callum, to cheers from the other men. "I think we should leave first light," said Graham. The crew knew not to question Graham's judgment, for it always proved sound. Still, his announcement provoked anxiety among the men. "Will that leave us time to prepare for the journey?" "Aye, we have enough food stored now, and thanks to the wretched dogfish, the nets are freshly tarred." Graham looked out across the sea. "I've heard talk of foul weather coming. If we don't leave soon, we could be stuck for another week, losing money by the day. Set off first thing, and we'll make the start of the Lowestoft season. Say any goodbyes you need to. Let's meet back at the King's Arms at 5. With minds at rest, it was a merry crew who entered Sea Houses for the last time. Jimmy went to say goodbye to Maisie. It being a Sunday, she was in her cottage and opened the door red-faced. "These barrens will be the death of me." Fanning herself with her hand, she stepped aside to let Jimmy in. "You off, lad?" "Aye, we set sail for Lowestoft at first light." "Ah, what a time you'll have there. That's where I met my Dan. Fond memories I have of that place. It's cold, mind, and they talk funny." She grinned at Jimmy. Jimmy thanked her for her kindness and promised to call the following year. She gave him a warm hug. "Farewell, young Jimmy. Take care of yourself." He kissed her cheek and could have sworn she blushed. Maisie waved him off from her doorway as he strolled away toward the King's Arms. As he stepped into the pub, Jimmy realised he had come full circle. He leant over the bar to shake Stan's hand. "Ta for all your help. I'd still be sleeping on the beach if it weren't for ye." "No bother at all, Jim," said Stan. He poured a round of drinks for the crew. "On the house," he said, and found himself in receipt of back slaps and bear hugs. Graham raised his pint. "To the Stargazer!" "To the Stargazer!" came shouts from around the pub. Glasses clinked, and the atmosphere was merry. One quick drink turned into several pints, and Jimmy almost fell into the water as he made his way back to the boat. He'd asked Stan if any mail had arrived, but as usual, the answer was a shake of the head. The drink didn't fill Jimmy with cheer. Instead, it was a maudlin soul who settled down under canvas that night. He turned over and over all the reasons Clara might not have written. It had been several months, and he had sent 3 letters, all receiving no reply. His emotions swung from anger to despair that some terrible fate had befallen her. He soon fell asleep, but woke throughout the night, dreams of Clara dragging him from his sleep. "Dearest Clara, I'm not sure if ye have been receiving my letters, but I haven't yet had a response, so I hope you're all right. How are things on the island? I've not heard from my family either, not that I expected to, but I hope all is well. We leave Sea Houses first thing, bound for Lowestoft. If you would like to write to me, you can send a letter to the post office there. I'll check in often, so I don't miss it. The season here has been good, plenty of silver darlings ready for the catching. I enjoy working with the crew, and Martin has left me to myself. The thought of our journey south excites me, but I shall be sad to be further from you. I must go now, for it's only a few hours till we leave, and I should get some rest. I'll write again with news of Lowestoft. All for now, Jimmy." Chapter 32. September 1913.
At dawn, the crew arrived, bleary-eyed and suffering the effects of the previous evening. Their first 2 days of sailing passed without incident. The wind was behind them, and the stargazer cut an impressive sight as she tore through open water. Jimmy and the men worked in shifts and rested when needed, but bursts of sleep were short, for excitement kept them alert. On the third night at sea, a fat blob of rain landed on Jimmy's cheek, waking him from his brief slumber. Graham sat straight-backed, face strained, staring at the sky. Dark clouds rushed through the air, catching one another and turning black. Another dash of water to the skin. The wind was strengthening, its low whine becoming a cry, emitting a powerful scream across the vast sea.
"It's a northeasterly," shouted Graham.
All men were awake, their bodies tossed around with each mountainous wave. Jimmy grabbed hold of the gunwale as the boat heaved onto a crest and plunged back down. There was no haste to the crew's movements, for what they needed were careful, clear heads. Water lay like oil on the deck. One misstep and they would skid overboard. The bow cut through banks of water, slicing through sharp as a knife. Foam clung to the men's beards, and vision blurred with a barrage of spray. Graham guided the vessel near enough to the land to follow its curve, but far enough from the rocks that could scupper them. 3 months of sailing together proved a useful advantage, for no voice carried above the squall, and the men read each other's movements by instinct. An almighty gust caught the lugsail and tore at its corner like tissue paper. Jimmy prayed the sail would hold long enough to get them to safety. The men fought on, and as the wind eased, they knew they had won.
"We're through it,"
yelled Graham, barely visible beneath the hood and cap of his sou'wester.
"Where are we?"
asked Jimmy.
"Good question, lad. We'll wait for daylight before I answer that."
No one cared where they were. They were alive. That was all that mattered. Daylight broke through thick raging clouds, and the men found their bearings. Impressive cliffs rose from angry waters, their white flanks a beacon against the grey sea and sky.
"We're at Flamborough Head," called Graham. "The lug needs urgent attention. We'll call into Bridlington Harbour to get it seen to."
The crew raised their hands to show they had heard the skipper. Fortunes changed, and on a rising tide they entered the quay with ease. With the anchor down, a pilot boat came alongside, handing bread, beef and water to the grateful crew. The lugsail needed repairing, and the pilot assured Graham this would be no problem. He offered to take them to dry land, and they welcomed the suggestion. Bridlington was a delight. Everyone was hospitable. It had everything a seaman could wish for, and proved a welcome change from the Stargazer. By the following evening, with the lugsail mended and fresh supplies on board, they headed back to the open sea. The weather was kind, and it wasn't long before they passed the Humber with East Anglia in their sights. Off the coast of Great Yarmouth, drifters littered the sea on the trail of herring. The Stargazer weaved a path through them, caught in veils of smoke that poured from their chimneys. Graham stood beside Jimmy, pointing at the steam drifters.
"If the herring are kind to us, we'll be sailing one of those next year."
As they neared Lowestoft, all men gazed at the land growing ever larger before their eyes. A creamy ribbon of sand wrapped the coastline, stippled with small boats and guarded by squat tin huts. Beyond it lay a jigsaw of buildings, squeezed together and shrouded by smoke that poured from roofs. Graham climbed to the bow and spread his arms wide.
"Welcome to Lowestoft, lads, the most easterly point of England."
Cheers of relief filled the air.
"To the herring," said Samuel.
"To the herring, lassies," said Callum, and Graham rolled his eyes. A tugboat helped them into the harbour, and they moored up beside vessels of every shape and size. Grand buildings fringed the outskirts of the harbour, presiding over the frenetic activity below. The crew threw their bags and kists onto the harbour side and grinned as their feet settled on dry land. They pushed their way through crowds of fishermen, buyers and herring girls, swerving to avoid the crans being winched from boats.
"Off to the grit, lads,"
called Graham, and the crew followed him as he disappeared through the crowd. North Shields. Chapter 33. June 1913. Reverend Barnes pulled the trap to a halt beside Beale Station. "Whoa!" he called, the horse whinnying as her hooves scuffed the dirt track. He jumped to the ground and helped Clara climb down. After fetching her bag, he looked her square in the eye. "Do you want me to wait with you?" "No, thank you, sir. I'm fine," she lied. "Very well," he said, unconvinced by her bravado. Before driving off, Reverend Barnes pointed out the platform Clara must wait on and explained what she might expect from the train. He turned the trap around before reaching down and squeezing her hand. "Go well, Clara. You will be in my prayers." With a look of sadness, he let her hand go and jerked the horse's reins, and the trap disappeared back down the track. Clara took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. A porter appeared to assist with her bag, and soon she was on the platform. She had taken care with her appearance. Her long auburn hair sat pinned beneath a bonnet, and she had worn her smartest dress. Her boots were well polished, and she had replaced the missing buttons on her jacket, one of the few items of her mother's that Bill had allowed her to keep. Only her eyes betrayed her as a novice traveller. She clasped her gloved hands together to stop them shaking and took deep, careful breaths to stem threatening tears. Her legs twitched, and she fought the urge to pace the length of the platform. Instead, she stood stock still, allowing only her head to move as she scanned the horizon for signs of the train. Far in the distance, a small puff of white cloud appeared above the treetops. Clara watched it grow larger, turning from grey to black and billowing out over the countryside. A roaring, clattering sound grew louder until it became almost deafening. Clara's eyes grew wide as the train approached. Struck by awe and terror in equal measure, she watched as the vast machine thundered towards her. It filled the air with screeching and scraping of metal on metal, and a plume of thick grey smoke. The train shuddered to a halt, emitting a violent blast of steam with a piercing squeal that sent Clara's hands to her ears. Men with blackened faces appeared through the smoke, fanning themselves with sea air, a welcome relief from the heat of the cab. A porter appeared, picking up her bag and guiding her towards a carriage. He opened a door and signalled that she should climb aboard. "You need to get in, miss," he explained. "The driver will want to be on his way." He took her gloved hand and helped her climb the steps. Clara found her way to a seat and settled herself down. The carriage was near empty, bar an elderly gentleman reading a broad sheet. She let out a sigh of relief. At least she would not need to engage in conversation. Sitting on a comfortable chair, she rested her head against its tall back. With the shrill scream of a whistle and an enormous blast of smoke, the train jerked forward. Gripping the edges of her seat, Clara steadied her body against the sporadic movements of the train. Only when it settled into a steady motion did she let herself relax. A greasy film covered the window, and Clara pulled on a leather strap to lower it. Cool air flooded the compartment and soothed her tense features. Countryside rushed past in a blur, the train skirting the line of the coast. As the island appeared on the horizon, she turned her face away, staring at the blank wall ahead. She could not confront her emotions in this public space. Her bravery had its limits, and Clara was determined to hold on to her composure for as long as she could. When she felt it was safe, she turned her gaze back beyond the window. Shrouded in smoke from the train's funnel, Clara pressed her face nearer the opening to get a better view. The stench of coal stuck heavy in her nostrils, and flecks of soot caught her eyes. She whipped her head back and pulled the window so only a sliver of breeze slipped through. The last thing she wanted was to turn up on her grandparents' doorstep as sooty as a chimney sweep. The Herring girls' tales of freedom and independence played on her mind. They told of the sights they had seen and adventures they had had. The difference, thought Clara, was they had chosen their path, whereas she had little choice. But it was up to her to make the best of it.
The rocking of the carriage calmed her. Clara's head nodded against her seat, and she drifted into a semi-conscious slumber. Her head snapped up each time the train slowed. Clara stirred as the train arrived at an enormous station. The platforms were teeming with bodies, and she spun around, trying to get her bearings. The elderly gentleman behind her was folding his paper, and Clara turned to him. "Excuse me, sir, could you tell me where we are?" "Miss, this is Newcastle. Where are you heading?" "North Shields." "You need to change here, miss, and catch another train. Best be quick about it." A guard walked past the carriage, checking doors were closed before the train moved on. Clara grabbed her bag and rushed to the door. She fumbled with the handle. Noticing her distress, the guard came and assisted. "Could you tell me where I can find the train to North Shields?" "Hi, miss, you want that platform there," he said, pointing in the direction Clara must go. "How long till the next train leaves?" "You've got 15 minutes, pet. No need to panic." Clara wove her way through the station. People thrust themselves past her, and in her confusion, she collided with a suited man who shouted for her to get out of his way. Screeches of whistles assaulted her ears, along with shouts of unkempt young men and cries of children dragged along the platform behind harassed mothers. Clara moved on, eager to be past the chaos. She reached the platform and didn't have long to wait before the train arrived. She was growing accustomed to the noise and smells of these metal monsters and found herself a seat with ease. Soon the train was speeding on, turning pitch black as they went through a tunnel. Clara relaxed as daylight flooded in once more, but her relief was short-lived, for beyond the window she saw they were high above the land, racing across a large iron viaduct. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the seat tightly, grateful when the train pulled into the station. It was less crowded than Newcastle, and finding her way out onto the street was straightforward enough. Unsure of the direction she should take, she followed a path down towards the river. Throughout the town sprawled towering buildings of red, brown and grey. She recognised the salty tang of her island, but here it mingled with smoke that left an unpleasant taste on her tongue. It tinged the air dull grey, and an acrid smell caused her to cover her nose. A sign announced she had reached Fish Quay, which equalled Newcastle Station in its bustle. She pushed her way through crowds of men and herring girls, all engaged in the business of finding gold in silver darlings. Ahead of her lay a river, its gaped mouth meeting a vast expanse of grey sea. Loath to linger in the intimidating crowd, she pushed on. Clara climbed a mountain of steps, edged by tightly packed buildings that oozed a stench of squalor. A toothless man, clothes stained and face grimy, lurched from a doorway. Clara let out a small yelp, sidestepping him and pushing on higher. She turned several times, but the man remained leaning against a crumbling wall, sucking on a pipe and showing no desire to follow her. Children clothed in rags ran in and out of windowless buildings, and several times Clara felt the slime of human excrement beneath her boots. At the top of the stairway, she leaned against a low wall to catch her breath, rubbing her boots against the stone to remove any filth. Clara walked on. Streets widened, and houses took on a more genteel appearance. She stopped to ask a passing woman for directions. The lady looked Clara up and down, surprised by her destination. "They won't welcome you selling up there," she said. Not understanding the woman or knowing how to reply, Clara nodded and continued on her way. She walked higher through the town and along a cobbled lane, past towering houses that would have dwarfed her island cottage. A folded piece of paper lay in the pocket of her skirt. She pulled it out and reviewed the map Bill had given her. Clara studied the numbers on the houses until she found a polished brass plaque with 20 displayed on it. She looked up at the house. This must be it. It seemed to stretch to the sky, 4 floors displaying large windows whose glass glinted in the sunlight. There was no salty residue clinging to them the way it covered windows of her cottage. The frames were crisp, bright white. Clara took a deep breath.
placed her hand on smart black railings and walked up the stone steps. The red front door housed a large brass knocker that sat in the jaws of a lion's head. Clara put her bag down and rapped the knocker 3 times. She heard scurrying footsteps approach. The door opened and a uniformed lady stood, wiping her hands on a pressed white apron. "Yes?" she demanded. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "We're not buying anything," said the lady, before moving to shut the door. Clara stepped forward and pushed the door open again. "I'm not selling anything. I'm here to see my grandparents. I think they live here." The lady stared hard at Clara. Clara stared back. The pinched features and grey hair pulled back from her face gave her an unwelcoming appearance. "Wait here," she said. Clara stood on the doorstep, wondering what she should do. Minutes crawled. Still no one came. Clara turned and heard the door open behind her. An old man in a smart suit stood in the doorway, a shiny pocket watch poking out of his breast pocket. On seeing her, he lurched back as if punched in the chest. Grabbing hold of a polished table, he recovered himself, placed an eyeglass to his eye, and leaned forward. "Anna?" No, Anna was my mum. My name is Clara." Clara thought she was going to have the door slammed on her again, but the man staggered inside, calling over his shoulder. "Well, don't stand there like some street urchin. Come inside." Chapter 34. June 1913. A large tiled hallway led into a grand imposing room. As Clara walked through, she clutched the door frame and gasped as she took in her surroundings. Images of exotic birds stroked the towering walls. Unlike the practical worn wood of her island cottage, here were sumptuous cushioned chairs and settees in many shades. She had to restrain herself from rushing over and caressing the silk fabrics. Every surface housed ornaments, and lush plants crowded all corners of the room. Sit down, the old man muttered, and motioned to a wooden-framed armchair of soft crimson velvet. Clara edged through the room, wary of knocking into a decorative table and sending its contents tumbling. On her chair, she perched at its edge, feeling drab against this technicolor backdrop. The woman in the starched apron reappeared, and Clara's grandfather leaned in close to mutter something in her ear. The woman scuttled off, and her grandfather sat himself on a settee. Clara opened her mouth to break the silence, but he held up his hand to stop her. "Best wait, my dear. Your grandmother will be along any minute to hear all you have to tell us." Uncomfortable in the silence, Clara shifted and looked at the floor. Her grandfather's fingers rapped on a polished table, and the loud tick-tock of a clock rang out. The maid returned with a silver tray, laying its contents out on a low-lying table. "Thank you, Sybil," her grandfather said as the maid retreated once more. His crossed legs twitched, and his left hand rested on his face, stroking a grey moustache. Clara searched for signs of her mother in his features, but found none. The clock ticked on. An elderly woman appeared in the doorway. Her back was stooped, and her white hair was thinning. As she moved through the room, her black skirts rustled like the marram grass of the island's dunes. A lump came to Clara's throat at the memory of her island, and she pushed it away. The lady sat herself down opposite Clara and looked up. Clara held her gaze. The woman studied her. "Andrew, what is all this about? Who is this young woman?" Her voice was clear and cool, displaying no emotion and triggering a fit of nervousness in Clara. "This young lady claims to be our granddaughter." I am," said Clara, her usual forthrightness deserting her. "Speak up, girl." "I am Clara, your granddaughter," she said this time with more confidence. Why should she be nervous or ashamed? It wasn't her fault they had never met. "We weren't expecting you." Clara met this news with surprise. Hadn't her dad said he had written? "Oh, I'm sorry.
My dad said he had written to you. Her grandfather snorted. I wouldn't trust anything that man says. He wrinkled his nose as if he had caught the whiff of a foul smell in the air. Clara bristled. Bill had hurt her, but she knew at heart he was a good man and didn't like the tone her grandfather was taking. In the room's silence, she wondered if she had ever seen her dad write. Could he write? Surely he wouldn't have lied to her about it. But he wasn't himself anymore, so anything was possible. Her grandmother reached down and rang a little silver bell. Its tinkling rang out through the room, and Sybil appeared. Pour the tea, please, Sybil, said the old lady. Clara's eyes widened at the sight of the maid pouring tea from a china pot into china cups. Why couldn't her grandparents pour their own damn tea? Sybil handed Clara a cup and saucer covered with pictures of pink and blue butterflies. My little butterfly. She pictured Anna sitting at the table, chiding as Clara's mind drifted everywhere, but the task in hand. Clara smiled at the memory. Is there something amusing, child? No, grandmother, I'm sorry. I was just thinking of home. By the looks of it, this is your home now, girl, and it doesn't appear we have a lot of say in the matter. She glared at Clara. We want no talk of that wretched island in our home, she added in a venomous whisper. There, Phyllis, soothed her grandfather, patting his wife's hand. I shan't be staying long, said Clara, though she had nowhere else to go. It will be nice to get to know you. She squeezed a small smile. We'll see about that, muttered her grandmother. After they'd sipped their tea in silence, Phyllis rang the silver bell. Sybil, show Clara to the guest room. Yes, ma'am. Clara replaced her cup and saucer on the tray, gave her grandparents a polite smile, then followed the maid from the room. Sybil was smaller than Clara, but insisted on carrying Clara's bag. When Clara offered to help, the maid seemed offended, despite her panting. She led Clara up a wide oak staircase, its treads covered in deep, thick carpet. The room Clara entered was the size of her cottage. Thick curtains held back the darkness outside, soft lamplight giving its features a warm glow. Once Sybil had departed, Clara sat herself down on the bed, sinking into its heather-like softness. Dark wood and rich hues filled the room. Printed flowers poked their paper petals out from beneath an endless array of framed pictures and photographs on the walls. A small girl peered out with serious eyes, hand resting on the knee of a woman swathed in long skirts, buttoned up tight in a stiff blouse. Clara stroked the photograph, for the child must be her mam. Running her fingers over the papered walls, Clara journeyed through an array of exotic lands, painted in delicate watercolours and vivid oils. She searched through the solemn faces, gazing out of frames, scrutinising them for traces of Anna's likeness. At a polished dresser, Clara picked up an ornate silver frame, its metal twisted in intertwining curls. Inside was a young woman Clara recognised as her mam. It must be the last photograph before she left for the island. She hugged the frame to her chest, its black and white presence bringing more comfort than any luxurious furnishings. Her bag sat waiting for her to unpack, but Clara climbed onto the bed and, lying on her side, placed the frame opposite her. It was the first time she had seen Anna's face in months, and a mix of love and agony twisted in her stomach. She began speaking, telling Anna of all that had come to pass. What would her mam think, she wondered, to see Clara lying on a bed in her childhood home? Clara whispered at the photograph. Can you see me, mam? As she spoke, a light flutter of breeze tickled her face, and she hugged the frame close. A knock on the door startled her. She rushed across to the dresser and replaced the photograph before settling herself in an armchair. Come in. Phyllis stood in the doorway. Dinner will be served in the dining room in 15 minutes. Please be prompt. Without waiting for a response, she closed the door and Clara heard her footsteps receding. Sadness slowed her movements, but Clara forced herself out of the chair
and unpacked her small collection of belongings into the dresser. Its decorative ornaments rattled as she pulled open heavy drawers, and Clara wondered at the usefulness of such trifles. She splashed her face with water from the washstand and dried it with the soft towel hanging from the rail beside it. Her reflection stared out from the opaque glass, and Clara paused. She placed the towel back on its rail and once again reached for her mam's photograph. From mirror to photograph, she saw herself reflected in both. A deep yearning welled inside her for the life she had left behind. She dabbed away tears with the corner of the towel, then stood, pinching her cheeks and taking a deep breath. Keen not to be late, Clara checked her reflection and made her way down the imposing staircase. Unsure which was the dining room, she had tried several doors to no avail, when Sybil appeared beside her.
"Can I help you, miss?"
Clara wondered if Sybil suspected her of stealing the family silver.
"I'm looking for the dining room."
Sybil pointed to a door further down the hallway, and Clara nodded her thanks. There was a sadness to the sight of her grandparents sitting at a table of a dozen chairs, all but 2 unfilled. They looked up as Clara entered, and both frowned. Clara was unsure what she had done wrong. She walked across the fine Turkish carpet, took her seat, and smiled at them. Phyllis cleared her throat.
"It is polite to change for dinner, young lady."
"Phyllis," her grandfather warned.
"No, Andrew. It is best she understands correct etiquette from the start."
A deep blush rushed from Clara's neck until it prickled her scalp.
I'm sorry, grandmother. I didn't know."
She studied the silverware on the table in dismay.
"Do you have other dresses in that small bag of yours?"
Clara paused as she thought of the clothes she had packed. She had dresses, worn from years of working, unlikely to meet her grandmother's high standards. Before she could answer, Phyllis jumped in.
"We shall buy you some outfits tomorrow. You are a pretty girl, and we cannot have you being made plain by such dull clothes."
Clara wondered how, within a few brief hours, she had slipped from one world to the next. Sybil arrived with platters of meat and vegetables and served the food onto plates of fine china. Clara ate with care, allowing frequent furtive glances across the table in order to emulate her grandmother's table manners. She sipped her glass of claret, welcoming the warm sting as it slipped down her throat. The trio ate in silence, the sound of clinking and scraping of silver on china filling the room. Clara noticed her grandmother picked at her food like a small bird, and despite her restraint, Clara was the first to finish the meal. Unsure how to start a conversation, Clara distracted herself by examining the room. Geometric hues of oak and gold covered the walls, contrasting with the leafy green of the curtains and brightly patterned carpet. As in her bedroom, framed photographs and paintings littered the walls. The mantel housed bronze objects, candlesticks, a clock and 2 vases. More muted than the drawing room, the dining room still held an air of opulence. Andrew leant against his high-backed chair and crumpled his napkin onto the table. Sybil came in to remove the plates, and he thanked her, but seemed unable to find anything else to say. Clara tried to fill the silence.
"Thank you. That was a delicious meal. On the island we usually had—"
But before she finished, her grandfather interrupted.
"Well, it will be an early night for me,"
he said, standing up and nodding to the 2 women before leaving the room. They had conducted the entire meal in an awkward silence, and Clara wondered what her grandparents spoke of when alone. Sometimes a gulf is too wide and deep to cross, and Clara sensed meal times were to be hard. It was clear her grandparents wanted no mention of the island, but it was all Clara had ever known, and she had nothing else to talk about. Andrew and Phyllis were no different from her da. She was too much like Anna, and her presence hurt them. Chapter 35. June 1913. Clara woke on her first morning in her grandparents' house with a sense of foreboding. The dress she had travelled in lay on a chair beside the bed, and Clara stood to pull it on. She moved to the window and drew apart the heavy curtains.
Across rooftops, she glimpsed the familiar blue of the sea. With a hand held against the cold glass, she watched as gulls leaned into the air, gliding their way out and up along the coastline. Clara tore herself from the view and rubbed at the imprint she had left on the glass. She slipped on her boots and tiptoed downstairs. The house lay shrouded in sleep. With no one awake, she explored her new home a little more. All the doors were closed, and she turned the handle to the drawing room, doing her best to avoid any creaking that might wake the household. The ringing of the grandfather clock startled her. Its loud chimes caused the house to stir. She heard movement upstairs, and Sybil scuttled past the drawing room to the stairs, taking them two at a time. Clara thought of the effort it had taken Sybil to carry her bag, and wondered if the maid had been trying to make a point. Floorboards creaked above her, feet crossing back and forth. A door clicked shut, and soft footsteps came down the stairs. Her grandfather appeared at the drawing-room door. He looked surprised to see Clara, as if he had forgotten she had arrived the day before.
"Good morning, Clara," he said, reaching for his coat and hat.
"Good morning. Are you off for a walk?"
"No, I'm headed to the shipyard. We are working on an important contract, and if I'm not there, my men will be idle."
"Oh," said Clara, "will you not be having breakfast?"
"No time, dear girl," he said,
and rushed out of the door. Clara stepped back into the drawing-room, and after examining some ornaments, made her way to a piano that filled one corner of the room. It was made of the same polished, dark wood as the furniture, and the ivory keys were a rich cream. Clara sat on the piano stool and pressed a key with her forefinger. No sound came, and she tried again. A note rang out and filled the vast room, crisp and clear. She continued to move a finger up and down the keyboard, intrigued by the ability of ivory on metal to create such a pure sound. Clara heard her grandmother, the fine satin of her dress, rustling like autumn leaves as she descended the stairs.
"I heard the piano," she called, entering the room.
"Oh, I'm sorry, grandmother. I hope I didn't wake you."
"No, no," said
Phyllis, as she crossed the vast carpeted floor. She settled herself down on the stool, causing Clara's muscles to tense at the proximity of the sombre woman.
"The last person to play this piano was your mother," she said, her eyes fixed on the keys.
"Oh," said Clara, taken aback. "I'm sorry if my playing has upset you." Her grandmother didn't answer, but spread her fingers over the keys.
"She was a fine musician," she murmured,
her fingers pressed down, and a few notes rang out.
"Do you play?" asked Clara.
"I used to."
She stared at the keys beneath her fingers.
Clara whipped her hands back just in time as Phyllis slammed down the lid, enclosing the keys in darkness.
"Sybil is waiting to serve breakfast."
Clara followed her grandmother to the dining room. They sat at the dining table, each as uncomfortable as the other.
"Are you educated?" Phyllis asked.
"Aye."
"Yes."
"Pardon?"
"We say yes in this house. We do not speak like commoners."
"Yes," said Clara, struggling to keep the annoyance from her voice.
"I attended the island school until the age of 12.
"Humph.
Well, I suppose that is something. Can you read and write?"
"Aye, I can."
Phyllis winced at Clara's turn of phrase. "Did you have a proper teacher at the school?"
Clara suppressed a smile.
"Yes, grandmother. I had a very stern school mistress called Mrs. McKinnon."
Phyllis seemed satisfied and made no more attempt at conversation. She set her plate aside and rang a small bell to summon Sybil.
"Sybil, please make sure the carriage is ready to take us into town in half an hour. I am taking my granddaughter shopping."
Clara met Phyllis in the hallway half an hour later. After issuing instructions to Sybil for lunch on their return, she led Clara outside and into a waiting carriage. The decadence of using a carriage to travel the half-mile into town shocked Clara, but she kept her opinions to herself. It was a bumpy ride across uneven streets,
and Clara thought how much more comfortable the journey would have been on foot. Outside a grand-looking shop, the driver jumped down and helped Clara and Phyllis down the steps. Clara thanked the driver, but Phyllis said nothing. She followed Phyllis into a bright room where different fabrics hung from rails on every wall. An eager young woman dressed in fine silk rushed across to them. She gave Clara a quick glance before turning to Phyllis, certain where the money lay. "How can I help you, madam?" "As you can see, my granddaughter needs some new clothes." She waved her hand to show Clara's current dress was most unsuitable. "Certainly, madam. Did you have any colours in mind?" "Yes, green would suit her complexion. Avoid crimson or pink. They will leave her looking washed out." Clara stood mute beside Phyllis. The shop girl scurried round, picking out fabrics and bringing them to Phyllis for approval. With a tape measure in hand, the young girl manhandled Clara, checking the measurement of her hips, waist and bust. She had never experienced such a level of scrutiny. Sweat prickled beneath her arms as the shopkeeper held the tape measure to her breasts. The young girl jotted measurements onto a pad of paper, and Phyllis held out her hand to inspect them. "Good, good, the same as her mother's." She handed the paper back to the girl. "We can have the dresses delivered to you a week today." "Very well." Phyllis turned, and Clara followed her from the shop, relieved the ordeal was over. Back at the house, Phyllis disappeared upstairs, and Clara retreated to her bedroom. A knock came on the door. "Come in," Clara called, but no one entered. "Come in," she called again. She moved across and opened the door. Sybil stood, the top of her head just visible beneath a pile of dresses in her arms. She pushed past Clara and threw them down onto the bed. "Your grandmother says you are to wear these until your new outfits arrive. They were your mother's," she added before retreating from the room. Clara sat on the bed and looked through the garments. They were island shades of green and blue. Silks and linens were plentiful, and the long full skirts fell across the bedsheets like paint on a canvas. Her hand stroked against jade green silk. Clara tried to imagine her mam wearing the clothes. She looked beautiful in her island work clothes, and Clara could well imagine how many heads she would have turned in these fine skirts and bodices. She lifted a bodice to her face, hoping to catch Anna's scent, but the fabric smelt musty, and she let it drop. Another knock came on her door, and Phyllis entered the room. "I see Sybil found the clothes. They are no longer in fashion, but will do until your new garments are ready." "Thank you, grandmother. Were these really my mam's?" "Of course," said Phyllis, sounding surprised. "I don't expect she ever wore fine clothes after she chose a life of drudgery." Clara tried to speak, but her grandmother held up a bony hand in protest. "Just be grateful you are the same size she was. Now, take off that disgusting outfit you travelled in, and I shall have Sybil dispose of it." Clara clutched her arms tight around herself. "I'll bring it to Sybil when I've changed," she said, with no intention of doing so. "Very well. Please be ready for lunch in half an hour." Once alone, Clara picked out a simple teal skirt and bodice and hung them across the back of the armchair. Removing her old dress, she folded it into her bag and stuffed it at the back of a drawer, hoping Sybil wouldn't find it. With difficulty, she squeezed herself into the flowing skirt and tight bodice. Once it was fastened, Clara found it was hard to move or breathe. She tried to lift her arms, but the stiff fabric held them back. Meters of thick silk slowed her, and her strides became shuffles. Clara thought about the walks she had taken around the island. No wonder her mam had swapped silk for cotton on her arrival. Clara made it through lunch unscathed. Once more, conversation was stilted and scant. Phyllis kept glancing at her across the table, and Clara wondered if she had left a trace of food on her face. "I need to lie down," said Phyllis once Sybil had cleared the plates. "Make yourself at home in the drawing room. There are books you can read if they are not too difficult for you." Alone in the dining room, Clara sighed and tucked her chair under the table. She pulled a book from the shelf in the drawing room and sat down and read. Before long, she became restless,
eager for activity. Grateful for the forethought to pack her needles and yarn, Clara went to retrieve her knitting from the bedroom. As she climbed the stairs, she noticed a strange squealing coming from her grandparents' bedroom. She crept along the corridor. Phyllis's door stood ajar, and Clara held her breath as she peered through the crack. Her grandmother sat on a stool by the dresser with her back to the door. She was rocking back and forth, and Clara realised with alarm her hands were tearing at the thin white hair on her head. The squeals continued, turning to grunts. Phyllis's hands moved from her hair and balled into fists, hitting at the legs beneath her skirt. Clara was an intruder, but couldn't tear herself away. She moved her head as close to the door as she dared. Picture frames covered the dresser, the same beautiful face staring out of each. Anna, Phyllis groaned, hitting herself harder and rocking with such urgency Clara worried she might fall. Noise from downstairs made Clara jump, and she whipped her head from the door. Phyllis heard it too, pushing back her stool, which tumbled to the floor. Clara ran to her room. Phyllis's door squeaked open for a moment, before being slammed shut. Clara's entire body was shaking. The woman she had seen was so far removed from the dour elderly lady with whom she'd spent the morning. She looked down at her skirt and wondered if it was her likeness to Anna that had caused such an upset. Not wanting to disturb Phyllis further, she pulled her knitting from her bag and stayed in her bedroom until her grandfather returned. When Phyllis came downstairs to greet him, she was her usual composed self, and Clara wondered if she had imagined what she had seen. Chapter 36. August 1913. Life in her grandparents' home was proving a peculiar mix of tedium and unease. Despite the bright colours of its rooms, sadness filled the space like an unwelcome houseguest. As the weeks wore on, Clara realised her grandparents spent little time together. When at home, Andrew would be in his study, while Phyllis kept to her bedroom. Clara knew her grandfather no better than the day she arrived. He offered pleasantries if their paths crossed and maintained a jovial veneer, but gave nothing of himself away. Most days, Phyllis did not appear until midday, complaining that a headache kept her in her bed. She was often silent, but prone to sudden bouts of irritation that left Clara on edge. Weight had dropped off her since Clara's arrival, and no amount of styling hid the ever-growing bald patches on her scalp. Grey skin hung from sharp cheekbones, and her hunched back seemed more pronounced as she shuffled through the house like a ghost. Several times, Clara heard mournful whimpers, grunts and cries filtering through the thick bedroom door. If Andrew was aware of his wife's condition, he didn't show it. Only Sybil appeared concerned. Clara found her loitering outside Phyllis's door, worry etched across her face. She spent an inordinate amount of time dusting the hall ornaments, and Clara suspected she positioned herself there to hear the little bell and respond with haste. It was clear Sybil thought Clara was to blame for Phyllis's distress. A source of discontent for Clara was how to fill her time. She had almost knitted an entire blanket since her arrival, but had run out of wool. All the books that caught her interest had been read, those remaining too dry to hold her attention. Clara began walking each morning. With Phyllis bound to disapprove, she timed her outings to ensure she was back before her grandmother appeared. Sybil knew what she was up to, but Clara was certain she wouldn't burden her grandmother with the information. One morning, Clara was thumbing through a book when her grandfather appeared. "Goodbye," he said, grabbing his coat and striding across the hall. She stayed in her position for several minutes on the off chance that he might return. When enough time had elapsed, she threw her book down on the settee and rushed through to the hall to put on her coat. She had one arm through when Sybil appeared. The maid stared at her, and Clara stared back. Sybil folded her arms, but ignoring her, Clara turned and let herself out of the front door. Memories of her first encounter with the town still firm in her memory, Clara opted to stay closer to home. Not 5 minutes from the house, she had discovered the most glorious park. On reaching it,
Clara passed under its wrought iron entrance and began strolling its well-laid paths. Women dressed in fine clothes passed her, parasols out, anticipating the sun breaking through. Clara felt self-conscious and out of place, before remembering that with her new clothes she fitted in with this upmarket set, in appearance at least. She strode across the well-manicured lawn and made her way to the wooded area. Her first visit to the woodland left her awestruck, for no such environment existed on her barren island. The rustle of leaves and uplifting birdsong filled her with peace and provided a welcome respite from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Clara ran her hands across the rough bark of an old oak and gazed up at its canopy of leaves, beautiful with the luminosity of late summer. She walked for a while before deciding to return home. The risk of being caught alone was not worth the momentary peace the park delivered. At the house, she let herself in and listened. All was quiet, no sign of movement other than the distant clanging of plates from the kitchen. Clara had just hung up her coat when Sybil appeared, carrying a silver tray. "Your grandmother is not well and shall remain in bed." "Thank you for letting me know, Sybil. Is there anything I can get for her?" "I need no help, thank you." Clara lingered in the drawing room, but finding nothing to fill her time, she headed upstairs. She had no wool to knit, and leaving the unfinished blanket on the bed, walked downstairs to find Sybil. The maid was busying herself by reorganising the well-stocked pantry. "Excuse me, Sybil." Shocked to find someone in her domain, the maid jumped. "You shouldn't be in here." "Sorry, I just wanted some advice." "Huh, very well." Sybil looked intrigued and paused her work for a moment. "I was wondering if you know somewhere to buy yarn." "That I do, but you have another thing coming if you think I'm going to be your skivvy." "No, I'm not asking you to get me some. I will buy it. Just tell me where to go." "They do not allow you out on your own." "Aye, but that hasn't stopped me so far." Sybil huffed. "It would give you an afternoon to yourself." The thought of Clara being out of the way seemed to work. "If I tell you, and you get caught, I will deny all knowledge of your escapades." "Fine," agreed Clara. Sybil gave Clara directions to a little haberdasher. "You didn't hear that from me. Understand?" "Aye, thank you." Sybil ignored the thanks and went back to the task in hand. Clara was nervous about venturing into the town, but any excitement was welcome, and if it meant negotiating the slums, so be it. She had a small allowance from her grandfather stashed in a silk purse. She retrieved it and slipped it into the pocket of her skirt. On her way out, Clara paused beside Phyllis's door. All was quiet. If she was quick, the chance of being caught was slim. Sybil's directions were efficient, and Clara found the small shop with ease. She browsed the yarns, selecting a variety of colours. At the counter, she paid with the money in her purse and experienced a rush of independence. She thanked the shopkeeper and tucked the brown paper bag under her arm. Buoyed up by her success in the shop, she walked the long way home through the town. It had been a lonely few months, and Clara had spoken to no one outside the household since she arrived. She headed to Fish Quay, its bustle now comforting rather than frightening. The sight of fishing boats moored up made her heart twist. Was her dad out at sea today? She tried her best not to think of home, but she missed Bill. She saw a young man unloading swills onto the quayside, and her thoughts turned to Jimmy. The shots of anticipation with each visit from the postman became twinges of disappointment as day after day no letter arrived. Clara walked across to a small boy selling winkles wrapped in paper. She handed him a coin from her purse and stabbed a pin into the makeshift cup, enjoying the taste of home as she wandered through the busy streets. Time was getting on, and she would need to brave the warren of squalid steps. This time she kept her wits about her, sidestepping suspicious objects and liquids that flowed down the stone. She crumpled the paper in her hand and looked up. A man was walking in front of her, dressed in a smart suit and top hat. He turned, and Clara flung herself backwards into a doorway. The moustached face of Andrew was unmistakable,
and she did not dare get caught walking alone against her grandmother's wishes. She expected her grandfather to continue, but he paused and knocked on a door. A woman, not much older than Clara, appeared. Tangled fair hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her bodice gaped at the top, exposing large round breasts. Clara clapped her hand to her mouth as the woman draped a dirty arm around her grandfather's neck. She waited for him to push the woman away, but he gripped her backside and pressed his mouth to hers. Andrew glanced up and down the street, and Clara held her breath. The woman grabbed Andrew's shirt and pulled him through the door of her home. Clara saw him kick the door, and it slammed shut. She waited a moment, then rushed up the steps, no longer caring what stuck to her boots provided she got away unnoticed. Chapter 37. August 1913. By the time she reached the house, Clara was sweating. In her haste to get inside, the door slammed and Sybil rushed through to the hallway, shushing her. She looked Clara up and down. "Whatever happened to you? Your grandmother is stirring. Hurry upstairs and change before she sees you. And make sure you have a wash. You stink of fish." Clara grabbed her skirt in her hand and took the stairs 2 at a time. Closing the bedroom door behind her, she leaned against it, trying to slow her heartbeat. With her breathing more regular, she threw the bag of yarn onto the bed. She took off her hat and unpinned her hair. The image of her grandfather filled her mind, and she retched into the basin in disgust. A quiet knock came on the door. "Who is it?" she called, wiping traces of bile from her mouth. Quiet knocking came again, and Clara moved to the door, opening it just an inch. Sybil stood holding a large basin of warm water. Clara let her in, and the maid set the heavy container down. "Thank you," she whispered. "This isn't for you. It's for her. I don't want her upset by your behaviour. The less she knows, the better," Sybil said, pointing toward Phyllis's room. "Well, thank you anyway." With Sybil gone, Clara grabbed a cloth and began sponging herself with the water. Its warmth was comforting, and the tension in her muscles eased as she wiped sweat from her brow and neck. Once changed, she made her way downstairs, reaching the hallway just as Andrew walked through the door. Clara blushed and kept her head down, refusing to catch his eye. "Evening, Clara," he said to her back as she scurried through to the dining room. Phyllis sat at the table, playing with the napkin in her lap. "Are you feeling better, Grandmother?" "A little. Can I help?" Phyllis shook her head and stared at the table. Andrew entered, but neither woman looked up. Sybil brought in their meal, and they ate in deafening silence. Clara was the first to crack. "How was your day?" she asked, holding her grandfather in a steady gaze. Unfazed, he dabbed his lips with a napkin and smiled. "Oh, so. Run off my feet as usual. I didn't get to see daylight till closing time." Phyllis dropped her cutlery with a clatter against her plate. "Excuse me," she said, as she stood and hurried from the room. "Well, I think that is my cue to head to my study. Have a good evening." Once again, Clara found herself alone. In her bedroom, Clara waited till she heard her grandfather leave before heading out onto the landing, keen to avoid their polite charade. She had crept as far as the stairway when Phyllis appeared. It surprised Clara to see her dressed and wearing her coat. "Are you all right, Grandmother?" "Yes, dear. I thought you could take me with you on your morning jaunt." Clara looked at Phyllis, her face reddening. I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, don't play the fool, girl. My window faces the street. I know you've been sneaking out each day. You're not as clever as you think." Clara looked at her, open-mouthed. "Well? Come on then. Is it far?" No, just to the park." "I think I can manage that." Phyllis had taken to walking with a stick and leaned on it as she crossed the landing. Shock crossed Sybil's face as she appeared on the stairs and saw the 2 women together, each dressed in their outdoor attire. Do you need me to call the carriage, madam? No, Sybil, I do not. My granddaughter is taking me to the park. But, that's enough, thank you. I don't need your fussing. I shall be all right. Phyllis crept her way down the long staircase. Clara opened the door for her and offered her arm, but Phyllis brushed past her, insisting her stick was enough support. Once over the shock of having a companion, Clara found herself frustrated by her grandmother's presence. The usual 5-minute walk took 30, and she brought with her the stale, close atmosphere that Clara longed to escape. Inside the park's gates, Phyllis pointed her stick at a bench and suggested they sit down. They sat a good metre apart, Clara playing with her fingers as a distraction from the awkward stillness. I know everything that goes on inside our house, and out of it, said Phyllis, turning and staring hard at Clara. Sybil? Phyllis laughed. Oh no, Sybil is a good keeper of secrets. My body might fail me, but my mind is as sharp as a pin, I can assure you. An unspoken truth sat between them. I know our home is no place for a young woman. I am sorry for that. Her candour left Clara dumbstruck. I cannot change the way we are, but I can consult some friends on how to go about finding you a husband. That might solve things. The thought horrified Clara. Grandmother, I don't want a husband. I want to go back to the island, but I can't, and will learn to make the best of things. Very well. They sat on the bench, watching people walking past. I would like to go home now. Clara stood and helped her grandmother to her feet. We were happy people once, you know. Losing a child, it does something strange to people. Before Clara could think of a reply, her grandmother had moved off, and Clara knew the conversation had ended as quickly as it had begun. Chapter 38. September 1913. Since their trip to the park, Phyllis had been warmer towards Clara, and her daily walks continued without secrecy. Among the town's lanes, she thought of Anna, walking the same streets all those years before. In her mind's eye, she saw her dad, reaching down to help the young woman refill her spilled basket, and her heart hurt. She had heard nothing from Bill since she arrived with her grandparents. She told herself the lack of correspondence made it easier to move on, but she didn't want to move on. The island filled her dreams, and in the small hours she would be back mending lines with Anna or reading in the caves with Jimmy. Sometimes she even found herself back in the schoolroom with Mrs. McKinnon. Thoughts of home clustered in her mind, and she walked on blindly. Her face to the floor, eyes bathed in tears, she stumbled along Fish Quay. With a fright, she walked straight into something large and solid. Stumbling back, Clara lifted her eyes and realised with horror the solid shape was a woman. The woman spun round and glared at her. She had a creel on her back, and its fishy contents lay splayed out on the yard floor, eyes bulging in lifeless regret. A slap of insults and screams hit her hard. She could not understand the words, but recognised them to be Gaelic, and there was no doubting their sentiment. Clara rambled words of apology and tried to move away, but the woman was strong and grabbed hold of her arm. She squirmed beneath the woman's tight grasp, the skin on her forearm twisting in a burn. A small crowd gathered, and a female voice joined the kerfuffle, scolding the older woman for her aggression. With reluctance, the woman released Clara from her grip. Clara stumbled back, rubbing a sore arm against her skirt. She kept her head down, ashamed at the scene she had caused. A voice was speaking to her. English words filtered through a soft, lyrical Scots accent. Apologies for my friend there. She's a little highly strung. Clara lifted her eyes to respond, but stopped short at the familiarity of the stranger's face, untamed, flame-red hair escaping its headscarf. The other woman was staring hard, as if pulling a memory from the deep recesses of her mind. Clara? Kitty? They stared at each other for a moment before leaping forwards into a firm embrace. Exclaiming declarations of surprise, Kitty linked her arm into Clara's and led her to a quiet patch of harbour wall. "You've gone up in the world since we last met," said Kitty, taking in Clara's fine clothes and bonnet. Clara groaned. "I wish I hadn't." Kitty took hold of her fingers, searching for a ring. "Well, I can see it's not a man, so tell me, Clara, love, how did you come by this turn in fortunes?" "How long do you have?" asked Clara, giving her friend a sad smile. "Don't you worry. I'm finished for the day. You can talk all night if you need to." Clara began her tale, wiping away tears, her friend reaching a comforting arm around her or squeezing her hand when she needed encouragement to go on. When Clara had finished, Kitty took her hands in her own. "What are you going to do?" "What do you mean? I can't do anything. I'm wanted nowhere, and there is nowhere I can go." Kitty stared at the boats bobbing in the harbour. "Clara, how attached are you to your finery?" Clara shook her head. "Weren't you listening to me? I don't want it." "I don't want it," she whispered. "All right, lassie. Can you meet me tomorrow evening?" Clara nodded. "Good. I'm not promising anything, but I might have a way out for you." Clara looked at Kitty with curiosity, but her friend jumped off the wall and walked away, calling over her shoulder as she went, "Tomorrow." Clara jangled with nerves as she walked back to her grandparents' house. She wished Kitty had just told her the idea. She suspected she might try to set her up with some young man or other. It displeased Phyllis that Clara had stayed out so late, and Clara's attempts at conversation were met with a stony silence. Andrew was at the office, and the two of them sat awkwardly at dinner, Sybil glancing from one to the other, and she cleared away plates, wondering at the cause of this latest disagreement. The following evening, Clara made her excuses and headed down to the herring yard. She lingered by the outer wall, not wanting to risk bumping into the angry woman from the previous day. Kitty appeared, removing her oilskins and cloth headscarf as she walked. Clara smiled as a frizz of ginger broke free, sticking out in all directions except those Kitty would like. "You came?" Kitty said, the hint of surprise in her voice. "Of course I came," said Clara, and they walked arm in arm to the harbour wall. Away from flapping ears, Kitty turned and looked at Clara. "How would you feel about coming to Lowestoft with us next week?" Clara almost fell off the wall. The name Lowestoft sounded familiar, and she was sure she had heard stories of it when they were on the island. "How could I do that?" "Well, you know we work in threes." Clara nodded, and Kitty continued. "Well, we've got a little spot of bother. You remember Alice?" Clara nodded again, remembering the plump girl with broad shoulders and a broad grin. "Well, Alice got herself mixed up with a local boy a couple of months back, and her monthlies haven't come since." Clara looked confused. "She's expecting." "Expecting what?" "She's expecting a barren, Clara. Pregnant. With child. In the family way." Clara flushed, not only with embarrassment at the subject, but also that it needed spelling out. "Oh. Aye. Well, anyway, she's been sick as a dog the past 2 months and doesn't show any sign of improving. She's spoken to the lad, and thankfully he has agreed to wed, but it means she can't come to Lowestoft and will be short one lass." "You want me to take her place?" asked Clara, wanting to be sure she understood. "Aye, well, that's if you can still remember how to gut fish." Clara laughed. "I think so. It might take me a while to get as quick as you, though, and I don't want to hold you back." Kitty smiled. "We'll be much worse off one person short." She nudged Clara. "What do you think?" "Aye, I'll do it. When do we leave?"